Brandon Michael Chicklis was born on July 24, 1997, in the industrial town of Lowell, Massachusetts. He was the first child of Paul Chicklis and Tricia Chicklis, a couple who raised him to value loyalty, honesty, and quiet strength. From the beginning, Brandon carried himself with a calm confidence that made him stand out. Not loud or attention-seeking, just grounded. Those who knew him described him as the kind of person who would show up when it mattered most. Dependable. The kind of friend who never forgot a promise. Growing up in the New England suburbs, Brandon spent much of his childhood outdoors. He loved hiking, fishing, and building campfires with his Boy Scout troop. That troop, Troop 41 in Fitchburg, became a second home to him. He stayed with it for nearly 10 years, earning his way up to the rank of Life Scout. By his late teens, he'd already learned the discipline, patience, and leadership skills that would shape the rest of his life. Those close to him say the Scouts kept him grounded, a reminder of simple values in a world that sometimes rewards the opposite. At Montechusett Regional Vocational Technical High School, known locally as Monty Tech, Brandon was a familiar face in the halls. He wasn't the type who drew attention for popularity or athletic fame. Instead, people remembered his kindness. Teachers said he was reliable. Friends said he was loyal, and when classmates ran into him years later, they'd still recall his dry sense of humor and easy smile. He graduated in 2015 with solid grades and plans to build a steady life, not a flashy one. After graduation, he began working at a local HVAC company. He liked hands-on jobs, the kind that let him fix problems and see immediate results. His family believed that steady work was exactly what he wanted, something that allowed him to help others, pay his bills, and start saving for the future. By age 20, Brandon seemed like someone who had quietly figured out who he was. It was around high school that he met Julia Enright, a small-town girl from nearby Ashburnham who talked about becoming a doctor. At first, theirs looked like any ordinary young love story. They dated through late high school, drifted apart for a while, and occasionally reconnected afterward. Even when their paths diverged, they seemed to maintain a friendly contact. No one saw a reason for concern. Julia was bright, artistic, and somewhat eccentric, but nothing about her raised alarm. To most of Brandon's friends, she was just another chapter in his early adult years. Outside of work and relationships, Brandon kept close to his family. He often visited his father, Paul, in New Hampshire, especially on weekends. Those visits were routine, so routine that when he mentioned going up for a drive, no one thought twice. His family describes him as predictable in the best way. If he said he'd be there, he'd be there. He never missed birthdays or family dinners. He never disappeared without calling. In photographs from those years, he looks like any average young man in his early 20s. Jeans, hoodie, short brown hair, a relaxed half smile. There's nothing dramatic in the images, nothing that hints at what would later unfold. That's part of what makes his story so haunting. It doesn't begin with conflict or danger. It begins with normal life, routine, familiar, safe. By the summer of 2018, Brandon was living in Westminster, Massachusetts, balancing work and social life. Friends say he seemed optimistic, focused, and steady. There was no sign of tension or trouble. June 23rd was supposed to be just another weekend, another short drive north to visit his father in Windham, New Hampshire. The plan was simple. He'd leave in the late morning, arrive by early afternoon, and spend the weekend catching up. It was something he had done many times before, but that weekend would never go as planned. Brandon left home that morning in his gray Honda Civic. He told a few people he'd be back in a couple of days. He packed lightly. The drive should have taken less than an hour. It was a clear early summer day, the kind that fills small-town highways with sunlight and movement. Everything about it was ordinary, until it wasn't. Because somewhere between Westminster and Windham, on a drive he had made countless times before, Brandon Michael Chicklis simply vanished. But one summer day, everything changed. Saturday, June 23, 2018, started like any other summer day in central Massachusetts. The sun rose early, burning away the mist that hung over the quiet backroads of Westminster. For Brandon Chicklis, it was a familiar morning. He had told friends and family that he planned to drive north to visit his father in Windham, New Hampshire, a trip he had made many times before. The drive was short, just under an hour, cutting through wooded stretches and small towns, a route he could have driven with his eyes closed. He left his home around 10 a.m., wearing casual clothes and carrying only the essentials. There was no reason to believe anything was out of the ordinary. He had filled up his tank earlier in the week and had been looking forward to spending a relaxed weekend with his dad. He was 20 years old, independent, responsible, and careful behind the wheel. He texted a friend that morning saying he'd catch up later in the week. Nothing in his tone suggested stress or worry. Then, sometime around late morning, his phone activity stopped. By that evening, his father began to worry. Brandon hadn't arrived, and calls went unanswered. At first, his family thought he might have made an unplanned stop or had car trouble. But as night fell and there was still no word, unease began to build. Brandon wasn't the kind of person to disappear without contact. His phone was always on, and if he were delayed, he would have let someone know. The next day came and went in silence. Messages went unread. Calls went to voicemail. His mother and father reached out to friends, hoping someone had seen him, but no one had. He hadn't shown up for work, and none of his close friends had heard from him. By the afternoon of June 24th, reality started to set in. Something was wrong. His family went to the Westminster Police Department to file a missing person report. Officers began taking statements noting the make and model of his car, a gray 2010 Honda Civic, and the route he was expected to take. At that moment, it was simply categorized as a missing person case. But the tone in the room was already changing. Police notified state agencies, and word spread quickly across social media. Friends and relatives posted photos of Brandon online. His smile, his short brown hair, the friendly face people recognized around town. Volunteers joined search efforts, checking roadside areas, parking lots, and local trails. Days passed with no sign of him. No financial activity, no cell signal, no sightings. He had vanished without leaving a single trace. For his family, the silence was unbearable. They retraced every possibility, clinging to hope but fearing the worst. The Chicklis household, once filled with routine and conversation, became a base for phone calls, news updates, and anxious waiting. Each passing day felt heavier than the one before. Then, nearly a week after he vanished, a lead surfaced. In the parking lot of a Hannaford supermarket in Rindge, New Hampshire, about an hour from where he was last seen, police discovered an abandoned gray Honda Civic. The keys were still in the ignition. The doors were unlocked. Nothing appeared stolen. Nothing appeared forced. It was as if Brandon had simply parked, stepped out, and disappeared into thin air. His car would later be found in a place no one expected. When police located Brandon's gray Honda Civic in the Hannaford supermarket parking lot, it immediately deepened the mystery. The vehicle was unlocked. The keys were still in the ignition. A few personal items were found inside: his phone charger, a water bottle, and a couple of receipts, but nothing that suggested a struggle or theft. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no visible blood. It looked as though he had parked it himself and simply walked away. Rindge, New Hampshire wasn't far from the Massachusetts border, but it wasn't a place Brandon was known to frequent. Investigators began by reviewing store surveillance footage from the surrounding area, hoping to see when the car had arrived. Unfortunately, the camera coverage was limited. None of the nearby cameras clearly captured who had driven the vehicle into the lot. The car could have been there for hours or even days. The search effort widened. Local police worked alongside the Massachusetts State Police and the New Hampshire State Police, combining resources to track Brandon's last known movements. Family and friends organized search parties. Flyers went up in storefronts, gas stations, and town centers. The Chicklis family's living rooms turned into command posts filled with maps, notebooks, and stacks of printed leads. For those closest to Brandon, the uncertainty was unbearable. His mother, Tricia, spoke to local media pleading for anyone with information to come forward. "He wouldn't just vanish," she said. "He's not that kind of person." His father echoed the same sentiment. Brandon was dependable, reliable, the kind of young man who always let people know where he was going. His sudden silence felt completely out of character. Police began analyzing Brandon's phone records. They wanted to know where his last call was made and who he had spoken to before his disappearance. The records showed activity until late morning on June 23rd, then nothing. His phone seemed to have gone dark around midday, somewhere near the small town of Ashburnham, Massachusetts. That was roughly halfway between his home in Westminster and his father's place in New Hampshire. The data point was small, but it gave investigators their first real lead. They started retracing the route. Officers canvassed gas stations, convenience stores, and traffic cameras along the possible paths he could have taken. Residents were interviewed, and a few reported seeing a vehicle that matched Brandon's, but none of the sightings led anywhere definitive. The only hard evidence remained the car in Ringe and the dead silence from his phone. Days turned into a week. The missing person posters began to fade in the summer heat. Each day brought more questions and fewer answers. Social media was flooded with speculation. Some suggested an accident, others hinted at foul play. Friends refused to believe he would walk away voluntarily. The police echoed that sentiment publicly. There was no evidence suggesting Brandon had planned to disappear. By early July, search teams had combed through wooded areas between Westminster and Ringe. They used drones, dogs, and boats to search nearby ponds. Nothing surfaced. Detectives began to look more closely at Brandon's personal relationships. Who had he spoken to last? Was there anyone in his circle who might know more than they were saying? That's when a familiar name began to appear in conversations: Julia Enright. The two had known each other since high school. They had dated years earlier, and though they weren't officially together, they had remained in contact. Friends described their relationship as complicated but not hostile. Brandon had spoken of her occasionally, but nothing in his tone suggested conflict or danger. Still, investigators noted the coincidence. Ashburnham, where Julia lived, aligned with the last known location of Brandon's phone. Detectives quietly began to verify her whereabouts on June 23rd. They learned that Julia had been home that weekend. She had posted on social media, gone about her daily life, and shown no visible signs of concern. The police didn't confront her immediately. They continued gathering evidence, building a clearer picture of Brandon's final hours. Behind the scenes, detectives obtained more cell tower data, vehicle movement logs, and security footage from highways leading out of Massachusetts. The case was starting to feel less like a disappearance and more like something darker. Then, on July 10, 2018, over 2 weeks after Brandon had vanished, a jogger was running along a remote stretch of road in the town of Ringe, just 6 miles from where his car had been found. What the jogger stumbled upon would shatter any remaining hope his family had been holding on to. The discovery marked the end of the search and the beginning of something far more grim. But who could do this? And why? The morning of July 10, 2018 began quietly in Ringe, New Hampshire. The air was thick with summer humidity, the kind that settles over the narrow back roads and wooded trails of the Monadnock region. Just after sunrise, a local jogger set out on a routine run along Route 119, a stretch of pavement bordered by dense trees and uneven gravel shoulders. It was a familiar path, calm and isolated. But as the jogger moved along a small embankment roughly 6 miles from the Hannaford supermarket, something unusual caught their attention in a dark, irregular shape partially hidden by brush. Curiosity gave way to unease. The jogger moved closer, realizing the shape wasn't debris or an animal. It was something wrapped, layers of fabric and plastic held together with strips of duct tape. The smell was immediate and unmistakable. The runner stopped, backed away and called 911. Within minutes, Rindge police and New Hampshire state troopers arrived on the scene. The area was quickly cordoned off and investigators began the slow, methodical process of documenting everything. The object was wrapped in a blanket, encased in 2 large trash bags, both tightly sealed with silver duct tape. When officers carefully opened the layers, they found human remains inside. It didn't take long for detectives to suspect that this was the body of Brandon Chicklis. The location, proximity to his abandoned car, and condition of the remains all pointed in that direction. But official confirmation required precision. The medical examiner's office took custody of the body and began the identification process that same day. Dental records confirmed what everyone had feared. The remains were Brandon's. The autopsy results were grim. Brandon had suffered numerous stab wounds. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be homicide. There were no defensive wounds indicating a prolonged struggle, suggesting he may have been attacked suddenly, possibly by someone he knew and trusted. For his family, the news shattered any remaining hope. 2 weeks of prayers and desperate searching came to an abrupt end with a single phone call. The disappearance that had puzzled both states was no longer a mystery. It was now a murder case. State police formally took over the investigation, working under the assumption that the person responsible had intended to conceal the body, but not for long enough. The disposal site was chosen for convenience, not permanence. Whoever did this had panicked. Detectives returned to their timeline, retracing the final hours of June 23rd. The phone data, once just a small clue, suddenly became vital. The signal that had last pinged near Ashburnham, Massachusetts before going dark, now pointed to a new focal point. Someone in that area had been the last person to see Brandon alive. And as investigators reviewed the data, one name surfaced again and again: Julia Enright. Detectives now had one name that kept resurfacing: Julia Enright. With confirmation that Brandon Chicklis had been murdered, investigators shifted their focus from search to pursuit. They revisited the final trail of digital and physical evidence, analyzing everything from phone records to traffic cameras. The data painted a narrow but telling picture. Brandon's phone had last connected to a tower in Ashburnham, Massachusetts around 11:30 a.m. on June 23rd. From that point onward, all activity stopped. The signal never moved again. That location wasn't random. It was where Julia Enright lived. Detectives knew her name already. She had dated Brandon years earlier, and their relationship had lingered in an on-and-off pattern. Friends described them as close but complicated, sometimes affectionate, sometimes distant. When investigators first reached out, Julia appeared cooperative. She came in voluntarily for questioning on July 13th, just 3 days after Brandon's body was found. Her demeanor was calm, polite but distant. During the initial interview, Julia told police that she and Brandon had spoken recently and remained friends. She claimed that on June 23rd, he had stopped by her house in the late morning. They had smoked cannabis, talked, and shared drinks. According to her, they had been intimate in his car before Brandon said he was leaving to meet someone else. She stated that was the last time she saw him. Detectives found parts of her story plausible. Brandon's car and phone records placed him in the area. But there were details that didn't sit right. She couldn't recall what he was wearing, what time he left, or what route he had planned to take afterward. Her answers to time-based questions shifted subtly each time they were asked. Then came the physical clue that changed the tone of the interview entirely. While Julia was at the police station, Trooper Sean Murphy conducted a quick visual inspection of her silver Toyota Prius parked outside. He wasn't looking for much and just any obvious signs of damage or irregularities. But when he looked through the rear window, he noticed something dark on the floor mat behind the driver's seat. It wasn't mud. It wasn't a stain from spilled coffee. It looked like blood. Murphy reported the finding to his team immediately. The car was seized and towed to a secure facility for forensic analysis. At first, Julia appeared surprised but remained composed. She didn't protest the seizure, only asking how long it would take. When detectives asked if there was any reason her car might contain blood, she hesitated and said she sometimes helped clean animal remains for an art project. It was an unusual answer, and it raised more questions than it answered. Samples of the suspected blood were taken and sent for testing. A few days later, the results came back. It was human blood, and the DNA matched Brandon Chicklis. The revelation forced investigators to act quickly. They obtained a search warrant for Julia's property in Ashburnham. Officers combed through the main house, sheds, and the surrounding land. What they found on the property's edge would shock even the most seasoned detectives. Behind the Enright home stood a treehouse, one Julia had built years earlier as a teenager. It was tucked behind thick trees, its wooden frame weathered by time. To neighbors, it was just a leftover piece of childhood. To investigators, it would soon become the key to unraveling the entire case. The blood inside Julia's car had opened the door. What waited inside that treehouse would blow it wide open. The search of Julia Enright's property began early the next morning. Detectives moved quietly across the small Ashburnham lot, documenting every square foot. Her home sat on a wooded incline, the kind of place that felt tucked away from the world. Behind it, the treehouse stood among tall maples, faded wood, rope ladder, and a small window half covered by a curtain. From a distance, it looked harmless, almost quaint. Up close, it told a different story. Inside, investigators found signs of recent activity. A new rug lay over the wooden floorboards. A small space heater sat in the corner beside a table stacked with notebooks and envelopes. Several leather straps hung from the wall beams. On a nearby shelf, they found business cards printed with Julia Enright's name and an alias that referenced dominatrix services. It was the first real glimpse of a life she'd kept carefully hidden. When technicians rolled up the new rug, they found dark stains underneath, stains that had soaked through the floorboards. Samples were taken immediately. Additional traces of blood appeared on the stairs and beneath the structure itself. Everything was photographed, bagged, and sent to the state crime lab. Back at headquarters, the results came in one by one. The blood from the rug, the floor, and the stairs all matched Brandon Chicklis's DNA. There was no doubt now. He had been inside that treehouse, and he had bled there. The next step was to piece together how he got there and why. Detectives returned to Julia for another round of questioning. She maintained her earlier story. Brandon had stopped by, they'd talked, smoked, and then he left to buy drugs. But when confronted with the DNA evidence from her car and property, her tone shifted. She said she sometimes invited friends to the treehouse. That blood might have come from a nosebleed. That she used fake blood for artistic projects. None of it aligned with the evidence. Investigators began tracing her digital footprint. Her phone records showed activity overlapping with Brandon's on the morning of June 23rd. Text logs revealed that she had messaged him that week, arranging to hang out. Her search history included topics about cleaning blood and disposing of biological material. It wasn't proof of intent on its own, but in the context of the evidence, it was damning. The picture grew darker when officers looked into her personal life. Julia Enright had a boyfriend, Jonathan Lind, a man several years older who shared her fascination with the macabre. Friends described their relationship as intense, obsessive, and secretive. On social media, she posted cryptic messages about blood rituals and energy exchange. Investigators began to believe that Brandon's death wasn't a spontaneous act of violence, but part of something ritualistic, something she had planned to impress or involve Lind in. Meanwhile, forensics from Brandon's body filled in the remaining gaps. The wound suggested multiple strikes with a sharp blade, likely delivered at close range. There were no defensive marks indicating he had been restrained or caught off guard. Small fibers found in the tape wrapping his body matched the carpet fibers from the treehouse. The evidence chain was tightening. The timeline became clear. Morning of June 23rd, Brandon leaves home. Late morning. His phone pings near Julia Enright's residence. Afternoon, no further activity. Days later, his car abandoned in Ringe. Weeks later, his body found. Each data point aligned perfectly with her location and opportunity. By mid-July, investigators had enough to secure an arrest warrant. Julia Enright was taken into custody on suspicion of murder. Even during booking, she remained composed, almost detached, asking procedural questions as though the situation were an inconvenience rather than a crisis. But the deeper detectives dug, the stranger the story became. Julia Enright wasn't just a young woman with a secret relationship. She was someone who had been writing detailed journals, entries that blurred the line between fantasy and confession. Inside those notebooks found in the treehouse, detectives uncovered sketches of bones, notes about anatomy, and passages describing the beauty of decay. One line, written weeks before Brandon's death, stood out. To give life through death is the purest form of control. For investigators, that sentence turned the case from a homicide into a psychological study in obsession. And as they read further into her private writings, they realized this wasn't just about one impulsive act. It was about a long-nurtured fascination that had finally crossed the line into reality. The search had uncovered the weapon. The blood had told the story. But the motive, the reason behind it all, was only beginning to surface. The search of Julia Enright's property had already revealed enough to prove that Brandon Chicklis had died there. But as investigators cataloged her belongings and read through her journals, they uncovered something far more disturbing than anyone expected. Inside the treehouse, mixed among the blood evidence and personal items, were handwritten notes, letters, and small envelopes labeled with phrases like offerings and ritual concepts. On a nearby shelf, police found bones, animal remains that had been cleaned and arranged for display. At first, investigators assumed they were part of an art project, but the deeper they looked, the clearer it became that this space had been repurposed. The treehouse was no longer a place of childhood nostalgia. It was a stage. Walls were lined with hooks and leather restraints. Candles, ropes, and metal implements were neatly organized along one wall. A small camera tripod stood near the corner, aimed toward a mattress laid out on the floor. Everything about it spoke of control, performance, and ritual. In the notebooks, Julia had described the structure as her sanctuary. She wrote about using it for what she called sessions, where she would meet clients who paid her to act out BDSM scenes. Investigators confirmed these encounters through business cards and online communications linked to a dominatrix persona she used. The revelation was shocking. To the outside world, Julia Enright had been an artistic, soft-spoken young woman studying biology. But behind closed doors, she led an entirely different life, one built around domination, control, and dark fantasy. Detectives began to believe that Brandon had been lured there under the pretense of a casual meetup. Evidence suggested she had contacted him days before his disappearance, promising to reconnect. Messages retrieved from her phone hinted at flirtation, familiarity, and nostalgia. Brandon, trusting her, agreed to visit. He likely had no idea what he was walking into. Forensic technicians reconstructed the scene from trace evidence. The blood patterns on the floor and walls indicated that Brandon had been standing near the center of the room when he was attacked. The angle and depth of the wounds pointed to a knife with a narrow blade. Based on blood distribution, investigators concluded that he had either been restrained or caught off guard with little chance to fight back. When questioned again, Julia denied everything. She said she hadn't been inside the treehouse with Brandon that day. She claimed the blood came from old injuries or from her art projects. But every new test contradicted her. DNA from Brandon's blood appeared on multiple surfaces. On the floorboards, under the rug, even on the stairs leading up to the treehouse. There was no longer any doubt. He had been killed there. The deeper investigators looked into her personal writings, the darker the portrait became. Julia kept journals filled with passages about death, decay, and anatomy. She wrote about collecting roadkill and using animal bones for sculptures. She described her fascination with the transformation between life and rot. One entry detailed a dream in which she dissected a body to understand its silence. It was this fascination, detectives believed, that blurred the line between fantasy and action. When forensic analysts compared the duct tape and trash bags used to wrap Brandon's body to materials found in Julia's home, the match was exact. The same brand, the same width, the same manufacturing pattern. It wasn't coincidence. On June 26th, just 3 days after the murder, security cameras at a nearby Home Depot captured Julia purchasing a new carpet, identical in color and size to the one found in the treehouse. She made the purchase alone, paid in cash, and loaded it into her Prius. The timing aligned perfectly with when investigators believed she had cleaned and staged the area after the killing. By now, the investigation had transformed from a case of a missing young man into one of the most disturbing homicides in the region's history. Detectives were no longer just piecing together evidence. They were trying to understand motive. Why would Julia, someone who once claimed to care about Brandon, commit such a brutal act? As more pages of her journals were translated into evidence, a pattern began to emerge. A pattern rooted not in anger or impulse, but in obsession. She had written about death as an art form, about the intimacy of control, about the thrill of crossing boundaries, and buried among those pages was one recurring idea. The desire to please someone she called Jay, that Jay would soon be identified as Jonathan Lind, and his connection to Julia would open the next chapter of the investigation. As detectives and forensic psychologists began to study Julia Enright more closely, the picture that emerged was one of contradiction. On the surface, she was articulate, educated, and deeply interested in science. She had studied biology and talked often about wanting to become a doctor. Her friends described her as eccentric but harmless, someone fascinated by anatomy, taxidermy, and Gothic art. But underneath that veneer of creativity lay an obsession that blurred art, control, and mortality into something unrecognizable. The journals collected from her bedroom in the treehouse became the window into her mind. Dozens of entries described her fascination with death, decay, and bodily transformation. In some passages, she wrote about collecting roadkill to study bones and reconstruct skeletons for art. In others, she romanticized the idea of decay itself, calling it beautiful proof of change. What might have once been an intellectual interest in anatomy appeared to have grown into something darker, an emotional fixation on death and the power that surrounded it. One entry, written months before the murder, read, "I love the way blood smells when it hits air. It's so human, so real." Another stated, "I want to cure the world of overpopulation. Maybe one day I'll start with myself." When confronted with these writings during interrogation, Julia didn't deny authorship. She explained that they were creative writing exercises, inspired by fiction and horror literature. But investigators by then had already connected too many dots. Her private writings weren't mere imagination. They were blueprints of her fascination. What stood out most to forensic analysts was her tone. The entries weren't emotional or impulsive. They were calm, precise, descriptive, as if she were documenting experiments rather than feelings. It suggested a mindset detached from empathy, where curiosity overpowered conscience. Her relationship with Jonathan Lind only amplified that darkness. Messages between them revealed that they often discussed blood play, cutting rituals, and shared fantasies about death. Lind would later admit that the two engaged in self-inflicted wounds during sex, spreading blood over each other's skin as a form of bonding. Julia wrote in one message, "Blood is connection. It's proof that something still moves beneath the surface." For psychologists examining her behavior, this fascination with blood, control, and anatomy pointed toward a personality driven by dominance and disassociation. She seemed drawn to the physical evidence of life, to test where life ended and control began. It became increasingly clear to investigators that Brandon's murder wasn't an accident. It wasn't even a spontaneous act of rage. It was a performance. A ritual carried out in the one place she considered sacred, the treehouse. By the time the profile was complete, Julia Enright was no longer seen merely as a suspect. She was the orchestrator of a crime shaped by obsession, secrecy, and a chilling lack of remorse. It was no longer just a crime. It was obsession turned lethal. By the time investigators had finished processing Julia Enright's property, the case against her was overwhelming. The physical evidence, blood, DNA, matching materials, and surveillance footage, formed an unbroken chain. But what made the case airtight was the psychological motive hidden in plain sight across her writings. On July 25, 2018, nearly a month after Brandon Chicklis disappeared, Julia Enright was officially arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The arrest was quiet. Detectives arrived at her workplace, presented the warrant, and led her out in handcuffs. Witnesses said she didn't cry or resist. She simply asked, "Is this about Brandon?" At the police station, Julia was calm but evasive. She denied any involvement in his death, repeating that Brandon had left her house alive. When shown the forensic results linking his blood to her car and treehouse, she hesitated, then said she had no explanation. She insisted her journal entries were being taken out of context, and that her dominatrix activities had nothing to do with violence. Investigators noted her detached demeanor. She never asked about Brandon's family, never asked how he died. Meanwhile, police turned their attention to another figure whose name had surfaced repeatedly: Jonathan Lind, her boyfriend. Through messages recovered from both their phones, investigators learned that Lind had been aware of Brandon's visit to Julia's home. He had exchanged messages with her before and after June 23rd, with a tone that mixed jealousy and fascination. In one conversation, Julia wrote, "I did what I had to do to prove it." Lind replied cryptically, "Good girl. Now it's done." Lind was arrested and charged as an accessory and for perjury during the grand jury investigation. He denied any physical role in the killing but admitted that he and Julia shared violent fantasies. The trial for Julia Enright began in 2021, delayed by procedural motions and evidence review. By the time the courtroom proceedings began, the public had already been exposed to the sensational aspects of the case: the dominatrix angle, the journals, the treehouse. But inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was clinical. The prosecution presented a clear narrative. Julia Enright had lured Brandon to her property under false pretenses, restrained him, and stabbed him to death inside the treehouse. She then wrapped his body, cleaned the scene, and dumped him in the woods of Ringe, hoping his remains would never be found. The evidence supported every part of that story. Blood spatter experts testified about the location and volume of stains, explaining that it was consistent with a violent attack inside the treehouse. The medical examiner detailed Brandon's stab wounds, multiple deliberate strikes, none instantly fatal, suggesting a sustained assault. A DNA analyst confirmed that Brandon's blood matched the samples taken from both the Prius and the wooden floorboards. The most chilling testimony came from Julia's own journals and digital records. Excerpts read aloud in court described fantasies of murder, fascination with human anatomy, and using blood as art. One entry, written weeks before the killing, said, "Death is the ultimate surrender. Some people beg for it even if they don't know it." The defense tried to frame her writings as performance art, expressions of creativity inspired by horror fiction. They claimed there was no physical evidence tying her to the act itself beyond circumstantial data, but the jury wasn't persuaded. In a pivotal moment, Jonathan Lind took the stand under immunity for perjury. His testimony painted an even darker picture. He admitted that he and Julia often engaged in what he called blood rituals, He described their relationship as one built on trust and shared extremes. He told the court that Julia had confessed to him privately that she had done something irreversible. When prosecutors asked him to clarify, Lynn said she told him she had ended it with Brandon. The defense objected, but the damage was done. After weeks of testimony, expert analysis, and cross-examination, the jury deliberated for less than 2 days. Julia Enright was found guilty of second-degree murder, spared the first-degree charge due to questions about premeditation, but convicted beyond doubt of taking Brandon Chicklis's life. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. For the Chicklis family, the verdict offered justice but not peace. They had waited 3 years to hear the truth spoken aloud. And though justice had been delivered, the loss remained permanent, a hole that no verdict could fill. But even as Julia's fate was sealed, questions about Jonathan Lynn's role continued. His perjury conviction would bring him back to court again, and when that happened, the Chicklis family would be there once more, demanding that no one involved escape accountability. The courtroom was silent when the verdict was read. Julia Enright stood motionless as the words, "Guilty of second-degree murder," echoed through the chamber. Behind her, Brandon Chicklis's family sat close together, his mother, father, and siblings, faces worn by years of waiting. There were no cheers, no outbursts, only relief, heavy and restrained. The verdict didn't bring Brandon back, but it finally gave shape to the truth they had lived without since June of 2018. For the prosecution, it was a clear outcome. The evidence had spoken with absolute precision. DNA, digital records, witness statements, and Julia's own words. There had been no mystery left to unravel, only the question of accountability. Julia showed little reaction as the sentence was read. Life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Her attorney placed a hand on her shoulder, but she didn't respond. The expression on her face was unreadable, calm, almost detached, the same demeanor she had maintained since the day of her arrest. Outside the courthouse, Brandon's family addressed the press. His mother spoke quietly, her voice breaking at times, saying her son was trusting to a fault, and that he didn't deserve to be remembered as a headline. His father thanked the police and prosecutors who refused to give up on the case, even when leads were scarce. "They gave my son a voice," he said. "They gave him justice, but the case wasn't entirely closed." Julia's boyfriend, Jonathan Lynn, was still facing charges. His perjury trial revealed that during the 17 days Brandon was missing, Lynn could have come forward with information that might have led investigators to the body sooner, but chose not to. The prosecution argued that his silence prolonged the family's agony. Brandon's mother testified again, pleading for the court to impose the maximum sentence. In February 2025, Lynn was sentenced to 7 to 9 years in prison. The sentences marked the end of a long, painful chapter. The Chicklis family could finally stop searching, though peace remained distant. The treehouse where it all happened was dismantled and removed from the property, its remains treated as evidence, not memory. Over time, the story of Brandon Chicklis became more than a crime headline. It became a cautionary reminder about trust, vulnerability, and the hidden lives people sometimes lead behind ordinary facades. Friends who knew Brandon described him as a light, someone who believed in giving others the benefit of the doubt. That same kindness, they said, may have been what led him to his final meeting. Even years later, the story still echoes in the communities of Massachusetts and New Hampshire. A young man who lived quietly, harmed no one, and believed the best in people, caught in the orbit of someone whose curiosity for darkness consumed them both. Brandon's story reminds us that even the kindest hearts can cross paths with darkness, and when they do, the consequences last far longer than a single crime.